the recent one in Colombia, and how you do, to some degree, what the Accord in Colombia put forward, which was to increase participation. And so that's kind of the general direction. I'm going to try to arrive all the way back from there to um, something that I read just in the last few days out of Time magazine and see if it applies in real time to the situation in the United States. So bear with me as I weave some threads that may not make any sense to you. I am currently, and have worked for a long time in support of peace building initiatives and movements in Colombia, and was asked by Father DeRue to serve on the advisory group for the Colombian Truth Commission, which obviously, Anil, a few of you would be very proximate to from what I just heard. They're in their third year, very difficult. First Truth Commission has ever navigated COVID, for example, that in the middle of your mandate, you are not easily able to travel and meet with people when your mandate is to engage with a whole range of conversations. Their report will be due toward the end of the year. It may shift over into early next. A little complicated to know how they'll navigate the end dates that are established for them. But being proximate to these conversations on a very regular basis and sitting with the commissioners in their early development of their, their mandate, I gave a little further reflection to what I consider to be one or two of the hidden aspects of the evolution of truth commissions. We quite often kind of jump from the, basically they initiated in the early 1980s in Latin America, around Argentina, Bolivia, I think was actually the first. And they often were, many of the early commissions were around commissions focused on the disappeared, which is an interesting word in the English language that came from the ways that the Latin American language, Spanish, uses it. But the evolution was often kind of in the big picture from Argentina to South Africa and then the plethora of ones that have come in many parts of the world. And you notice that even today, the United States is something that is increasingly being talked about both nationally and locally. The hidden aspect that I'm particularly interested in, I've been sort of tracing, is the shift that came from the early commissions that were either commissions that began to do some form of investigative work, often quietly, privately, deep dives into certain aspects of data, various forms of going to graves and other things may have been a part of that. It was often centralized. Sometimes they were external, often a combination, but there would be sometimes external commissions that were brought together. The rendering of their reports were often a moment of everybody holding their breath to see what might come out because it was not well known. So one of the shifts that came with South Africa was that the commission had a greater level of openness, transparency, but they also began to decentralize their activity. They traveled. They moved out more proximate to communities. There was more direct forms of participation. It was very gut-wrenching. A lot of criticism about the issues that a few of you mentioned between the tensions that exist between truth-telling and impunity and justice-making. Those remain very much at the fore. But I've noticed over the years, and so another one would be just if you look at the recent Canadian one, Canada had a whole series of things related to the First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples. Some of those were a bit narrow around topical areas and some became national. The last one that came forward, which was probably the most significant, started by looking at what had transpired prior to what they had done and found that there was really only one initiative that really seemed to have a significant difference that was made. And that the difference was that the judge who was the head of that commission never convened anybody to meetings he was doing at the capital cities, but actually spent most of his time traveling to the locations that were under question, sitting with communities locally. This is one of the aspects that I think is hidden in the evolution of truth commissions, that it has found ways increasingly to bring it closer to the actual geographies and to the people in the communities where they've been located. In Colombia, the effort pre-COVID, COVID of course impacted everything enormously, but pre-COVID, the idea that the commission worked with was establishing houses of truth, casas de verdad, which would be located throughout the country in much greater proximity to the areas that were particularly designated by the Accord as being those who had been hardest hit by the violence over the 50 years or more of the war. So we find here a couple of small principles that were the ones that I've been noticing in completely different avenues that seem to be relevant. One is the proxemics of peace. Proximity meaning that you have to be actually within close enough so that the conversations are felt to be significant and within reach. And that probably the single biggest criticism that I've experienced over 40 years of work in the peace building field in settings of armed conflict is the oft expressed view that what's happening up there is too distant from us. It's too far away, that those that arrive there don't always represent us. And so then there's a kind of a fragility around how people experience that distance. So proxemics, the anthropological concept, is how, the spacing of people. It's about the proximity of people. Of course, anthropologists use it for a variety of other reasons, but it's kind of an intriguing concept. The second is the notion of travel. That is that you go to rather than bring to. So so much of our models rely on some form of convening. And then the convening requires you to reduce and narrow. Who's going to come to that? You can't put the whole of Colombia into around the table. And so you have to figure out some way to do that. Interestingly, Colombia's peace accord negotiation in Cuba was one of the few that advanced something very significant in this direction, which was that I personally think that the beginning of the Truth Commission in Colombia started with the negotiation period. It didn't start at the point of the actual mandate of the commission. They did that by bringing widely cast sets of people directly to the table to talk to them about their experiences. There were large, in fact, fairly significant numbers of them. So it wasn't just a single representative, it was larger groups that spent time speaking to the negotiators about the abuses and harms and losses that they had experienced at the hands of the very people that were sitting at that table on both the government and the FARC side. So that was an evolution, most certainly. My probing on this, so when you start to ask this question, you have to look beyond your own field. That's one of the problems that we have, is that we get far too narrow into what we think to be the capacities of a particular profession to handle complexity. And so I actually found the greatest insight into this in the field of entomology. So I'm going to go there for a moment, and I'm going to ask you to bear with me while I float around. So in entomology, there is a longstanding subcategory of inquiry around what entomologists called the paradox of coordination. And the paradox of coordination, when it was first defined, was the study of insects who achieved collective purpose without centralized control. And that was called the paradox of coordination. How is it that a wider collective can achieve common purpose without centralized power or control? And the breakthrough on that was a couple of people who began to study termites, ants, maybe bees. There'd be a range of these that they might be following. And what they found was they landed on the concept of stigmergy. And now this may sound very weird, because stigma, we know stigma as a word meaning that a person is stigmatized, that is marked. But actually stigmergy, in the ways that they were using it within entomology, was the observation that the mechanism by which things happen is that as travel ensues in the pursuit of some resource or good, I'm going to spell it so you don't misunderstand the pronunciation of it. A scent is left in the landscape, S-C-E-N-T. That is an odor, a smell, a trace is left in the landscape. That was actually the phrase that they originally used. And others pick up that scent, other traveling ants or termites pick it up, and that begins to create a decentralized communication capacity that eventually coheres around building of large-scale nests or other things that they're attempting to achieve. It's a fascinating kind of an element. Having experienced a lot of different places where I noticed that the way change happened was not always, in fact, rarely directly at a formal negotiation table, I could immediately locate a range of ways that that was actually what appeared to be in motion. Probably the most prominent for me as an example would have been the process in Somaliland in the early 1990s. This is, of course, contentious across issues of when nations become nations and when they don't. Somaliland declared its independence, but it was based on I think, a Stigmergy-like model. In fact, I and a couple of folks from the Life and Peace Institute met with 3 elders who were at the very beginning of their travels. And they were simultaneous to the large-scale ADIS-based Somali warlord negotiations that were hosted by the UN and failed almost on each occasion. These 3 or 4 elders, they expanded out to a group of about 5 or 6 across subclans, exclusively in the north and northwestern part of the country of Somalia, now known as Somaliland, were describing a process in which they were going to engage in the traditional mechanisms of traveling, often coordinated in its early iteration by women, who by way of cross-clan, sub-clan marriages were in the unique situation that their fathers and brothers were fighting their husbands and their sons. And so the women in the traditional mechanisms were always the pre-negotiation diplomats. They could travel back to their families of origin and could open the process by which elders from other subclans could come through at a later point, using often some traditional mechanisms by which they engaged in ergetas, as they called them, or forms of sort of larger collective conversation that were hosted by elders. But their basic mode was, when we asked what kind of help they needed, they gave us very specific instructions. The instructions were, please don't do anything. Let us be. Don't get in our way. If anything, you might contribute some rice and petrol. It will fall apart if, in fact, internationals try to be too overly involved. That was pretty much the word of mouth. They set out to traveling. They literally traveled. They held thousands of conversations that eventually led to the Borama conference that brought together thousands of people. And over the course of 6 months, wide open, everything from singing poetry and grievances were handled in that format eventually by way of that mechanism. So there certainly are some examples of this. The things that I take note of are the following. One, that it requires going to rather than convening. It requires iteration. You have to go back over and again. You don't go just one time. If you go one time or 2 times, it's a form of tourism. But this had something to do with the development of what I would refer to as collective empathy as opposed to individual empathy. We often use the word empathy to put ourselves in the shoes of another person. This was about seeing the world from the perspective of a whole collective, from their location, and spending time in that location and coming back over and again. And as you're coming back over and again, and as you may be traversing other locations, you are literally hearing and dropping a trace of every conversation. So it's like an accumulated effect of what's being dropped in the landscape. So it's travel, it's presence, it has to do with a collective empathy. It often has to do with specific action that seems to be highly localized at the moment, but that has the traces of things that stitch what others are appealing to and are attempting to do in other locations. So there's kind of this cross-fertilization that seems to emerge from. Often the traveling is rarely done by anything that would approximate a single person or a designated exclusive team. This often grows into small collectives of people who are traveling. In Nepal, we mobilized around this basic concept for handling land and water and forest conflicts. And it's literally groups that are made up of members of each of the particular people that are in conflict who travel to spend time in the locations of those who see that conflict from a different vantage point around those issues. And so it's itinerate and iterate over and again that eventually leads to a possibility of sort of threading a common direction. So I'll use that as a small note to say that this week, and I know our time's short, so I'm going to try to draw this to a place where people can just jump in where they want to go with it. I read an article in Time magazine this week that just came out. Many of you may have seen it, perhaps not, but it dates back to it's a kind of a review of what happened on the election in November here in the United States. It was written by a journalist whose name is Molly Ball, B-A-L-L. And reading through it, it jumped out at me that this was a small descriptive piece, journalistically written, and probably with gaps, and certainly would have variance of interpretation depending on who you were. But it was a descriptive piece of how this might be describing for us a form of stigmergy in real time in a virtual world, which is a whole nother issue that we're facing. So my travel component is, what do you do when you can't actually travel? And that's, in COVID world right now, it's kind of stuck. But I jotted up a little piece. I'd be glad to send out those little reflections. They're kind of odd and they're pretty much off top of head, so I'm not sure how far I'd want to publish. But I found 5 things in the middle of that article. The article describes action behind the scenes of an unusual set of people who began to put in motion everything they could to assure that this election period would not be the downfall of democracy in the United States. And there were, in the opening line of the article, gives you one of the great dilemmas of the field that I work in, which is around the notion of if successful, nothing happens. And that's called at times a violence prevention, or the wars that didn't happen. We don't have any reports about those. So if nothing actually happened, it's often very difficult to sort out the significance of that. And so she opens with that line that, in spite of a lot of potential predictions that people were making, that this might be a very violent period, that didn't happen until January 6th. That happened at a much later point, but around the election period, it did not happen. So she was set out to figure out, why didn't it happen? And so the article tries to ferret that out. The things that I took note of that I would place into my language and not hers, so trying to make the bridge from how she's doing it. She talked about the first point being that it involved unlikely alliances, or what I would call improbable people and improbable initiatives. Improbability for me means that it requires some form of intentionality that reaches across what is not connected in order to find a link that otherwise would not happen. And it's fairly well described in the ways that it talks about people who are connected locally, nationally, in government, outside of government, in business, across activism, and across, in very concrete ways, as she describes it, across the Republican-Democrat divides. All of this, secondly, held in very quiet ways. Nobody made an announcement, nobody sought money, nobody proposed a big initiative. It was just people, if you want to put it in the bluntest of terms, people started to reach to places they felt they needed to get if they were to make any kind of difference. The second was what I would call a kind of a retake on Sun Tzu's famous phrase. Sun Tzu, of course, is The Art of War, the famous little booklet that was written. And one of his famous phrases was that you have to build a golden bridge of retreat for your opponent. And the golden bridge is often a metaphor of asking what options you're creating for the person that you're wanting to change as a part of your strategy, and not just getting that person to kowtow to your demands or to place them in a cornered position. This was the view. The golden bridge here, I think, had to do with something that I find really fascinating within a systemic view of deep polarization, toxic polarization, and how toxic polarization leads into violence. And that is the necessity of that system to function on the basis of reactivity in order to feed itself. So sociologist Vern Jancy, my colleague will smile as I say this, sociologist long ago in the 1950s, James Coleman, tagged this with a phrase that's quite memorable for some of us, which is the dynamic of reciprocal causation. As conflict escalates and intensifies. Reciprocal causation, you can kind of catch it in the metaphor, is when the cause of conflict comes from the reaction to the reaction to the reaction that begins to drive the dynamics that then become independent of the originating issues, so that the system perpetuates the escalating conflict on the basis of its capacity for producing reactivity. So the golden bridge of retreat could be recast, in this case, she didn't use these terms, but it's kind of the way that I articulated what she talked about, that among the many coordinations that they worked on was the ability of people not to counter-react if large crowds emerged. So that there would be efforts to pull back some. So, and in essence, pulling back for a time at a targeted moment and in key places from not doing too much activism, if you will, or counter activism. And that reduction in some ways began to remove reactivity. So you'll notice on January 6th that this was also the case. So that if we go to Fox News in the last few days, you'll notice that what they have to do is they have to go back to the summer to find examples of street activism in order to draw their equivalency to the January 6th event. You know, it's, I think, a deeply false equivalency. But the effort is to show that there is an equality of reactivity and damage and things that are happening. Here, the reducing, so this required coordination without central power with people who might have much more of the fingers on the impulse of street-based activism. It's kind of an intriguing note. The third is what I would call the golden thread. For me, the golden thread is sometimes more important than the golden bridge. The golden thread is a shift toward rightness instead of ripeness. Ripeness in my field is the term of Zartman, William Zartman from Johns Hopkins, who had extraordinary writer and studied much of this for years and years and years. He has a theory that's based on the herding stalemate, that people don't negotiate until they hurt so bad that they know they can't go further. And he has a notion of ripeness, especially for mediators. And I've always argued, not for ripeness, but I offered a metaphor of cultivation. I guess I come from a farming community. So we know that picking apples is cool, but anybody that didn't attend to their orchards got problems if they don't understand seasons, soils, and the process of what's being cultivated. It's a very different metaphor than ripeness, dashing in at the moment that things are ready. So this is, I think, golden thread is a theory of rightness, not ripeness. Rightness in the sense that there will be moments which are extraordinary in their opportunity, where the right people with the right relationships, with the right ideas at the right time can make a difference. This, Gary, I think, is very close to cure violence. The knowing where on the street with whom and in what conversation and with what idea makes all the difference in the world. And this, of course, requires a whole different set of ways that you look at it. So she describes in some ways, at least by my view, that this was in some ways the golden thread. The golden thread is when you stitch that right set of things together, and it holds together something that would otherwise not have been possible. And often it's in more of a preventative mode. The fourth one, which I think is particularly challenging for our field historically, is that perhaps the most significant influencer in the wider system may well end up being business. And big business, I think, today is connected with big tech. So these kind of are very difficult to fully sort out. So there are a set of people, I think, with some empirical evidence who would make an argument that the real transition came in South Africa at the point that business said no more. And so this one would make an argument on one side, this was the ultimate impact of sanctions. On the other side, it may have been the elements that kind of the future was on the wall of it. One could notice it here in the United States, that what we've been seeing is a question of whether this will sustain itself over time or whether it's a fleeting moment, that when business sneezes, social change ensues. So we've been watching the pulling back of the funding. We watched the Koch brothers, for example, begin to ask serious questions about their multi-decade investment and what they had unleashed. We're beginning to watch in the arena of entertainment and sports and the large-scale businesses that accompany those spaces, really beginning to question the issues of how have we participated in injustice, racism, and exclusion of people in our country, and what has been unleashed by this, and what's our responsibility. I don't know if it will be fleeting or longstanding, but there is a case that she's making within the article that points toward how that was a significant chunk of this. If somebody at the CEO level calls you, you may listen differently. So it's a curious theory of change of sorts. The final one is what I have called in the Moral Imagination, a book that I wrote, the web approach or the web understanding, using the metaphor of the spider. As you can see, I'm kind of taken with entomology. I maybe should have gone into that field to begin with. But the notion of the particular focus for me on spiders are two of them. One is their capacity to think strategically about spaces, and how that they understand that the anchor points are often distant from the places that they're trying to build to create the hold of the purpose that they have. The second is how they travel in that space, how they move around it to the very furthest outskirts. They begin to create crisscrossing hubs. They circle, they move from the center to the periphery. It's a constant movement, and it is a notion of repair that never ends. So a web is never ended. It's a constant flow of that activity. But the third is that it's a differentiation. So I had a journalist call me 2 weeks ago. He was doing an article on the partisan divide in the United States and was trying to draw on some of the people he had been reading. And he wanted to talk, he was using W.B. Yeats's famous Widening Gyre poem, where it has that phrase, the center cannot hold. And he was going to use the notion of the center cannot hold as the splitting, what will hold the center. And the metaphor behind it from a political standpoint, of course, was, I think, much more aimed at, we need to rebuild our center. We need to rebuild a capacity for compromise. We need to rebuild across the aisle engagement. A web approach has a little different understanding of the center that holds. It's not about the shredding of two sides pulling it apart. It's about the constant weaving and the infrastructure of relationships and the relational spaces that will be needed and will need to crisscross in order for the center, as this web, to hold to its fuller capacity and purpose. And to a large degree, this picks up on these things, themes of stigmergy. That is, the moving across in constant conversation with highly unlikely sets of people and relationships, the leaving of a scent of concrete localized actions in spaces that begin to cohere around a wider purpose. And the understanding that ultimately what we need is the capacity to build and hold strong to the myriad micro interdependencies that create the fabric of our relationships. And that notion of micro interdependencies is a constant flow. And it reminded me, and here I'll stop, of Andrew Mack, our colleague within the peace building field, who dedicated most of his life to the area of human security. He has a database of databases. They work across 5 or 6 of the largest scale databases in the fields of armament conflict studies, armed conflict. There are a whole range of these in Scandinavia, Europe, and Canada, the United States. Based on studies across all of those databases, some years back, they were making the observation that there was a trend toward, even though it appeared to be by way of the prevalence of the media presence portraying it, there was a trend that was beginning to reduce the level of violence across the globe if you looked at it with a larger perspective. This, of course, was picked up also by figure out of Harvard. There were a number of people that were kind of looking at different aspects of this. Andrew Mack's view was based very much on the empirical data, the quantitative databases that he was functioning with. His conclusion in one short phrase, I don't know if I have it completely by memory, I'll try to do it as well as I can, was that looking back across this period that they were studying and articulating the reduction of violence, his exact words, no one peace building group, initiative, or activity accounts for the change, but the sum total has had a powerful impact. And that's the difference between attribution and interdependent contribution. And I think that that's really what we're looking at. And my concern across this century that we're in, climate change, the things that most challenge peace building, how to respond to climate change, how to deal with large scale migration, how to deal with illicit flows of people, drugs, and guns, how to respond to elements of climate around issues, access and use of water, These are all issues that are not going to be well handled by any one nation. Yet our capacity to evolve a way to address them tends to revert back quickly to some form of representational convening, which has proven to be fragile and weak. We study a lot of peace agreements and their implementation at the Peace Accord Matrix, and the main finding is that we're pretty fragile. So we have these opportune moments to really do something, and they come forward. We pay a lot of attention to it. If you look 10 years out, we have a lot of fragility in our ability to sustain the transformational processes that we're trying to put in place. So I think so among the many things that I'm probably will spend the rest of my decades contemplating, where do we find new and different models for engaging these problems that don't rely exclusively on the notion of representational negotiation, and that then require a form of reductionism, distance, and fragility of implementation? And I think those are found in some form of connections of interdependency locally, looking at things from the perspective of communities who can engage in direct action but have linkages. So there's a localization component to it. Have capacity to stitch coordination without centralized control. That these are actually posing for us, I think, big dilemmas, and that's kind of the direction I've been thinking. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry I kind of rambled a bit too long to get to the conclusion of that.